3 decades ago, in the reign of Victoria, London was stolen by bats. Now it lies a mile below the surface. It was dreadfully inconvenient for everyone, but it opened a vast black ocean to you. Welcome to the Undersea. As far as openers for stories go, Sunless Sea is maybe my current favorite for how cleanly and quickly it sets up everything you're going to need to know about the game. London is underground now. It's underground because the bats took it. It sits on the shore of a black underground ocean. That might not make sense to us as outside observers, might not seem like that should be a thing bats should be capable of, but nonetheless, they did it. You're gonna need to get used to that kind of thing if you want to survive here. We should be grateful that we can figure out the rough time period at least. Let's take the win where we have one and see if we can't establish more about where we are. Well, firstly, we're still in London, or at least whatever could be rebuilt from whatever survived being stolen. And this new London rests on the northwesterly shore of a massive body of water. This is that aforementioned Undersea, which is spelt as though it's supposed to be pronounced with a Dutch or maybe a German accent, but I'll just be calling it the Undersea for easier consistency. What's going on in London? Well, it's still a city, and life is going on in about as normal a sense as possible. It's been 30 years after all, so I reckon that the amount of people that were around for the theft versus the amount of people born post-theft is really starting to lean towards the latter. People live, eat food, go about their business. What's going on outside London? Well, that's kind of the game. We explore the Undersea for a myriad of different reasons, and there's a lot going on in this place. For example, I first took to the sea to reclaim my late father's lost bones. There's a man in London who claims he knows where they are, but he wants to trade. There's a type of coffee, something only found along the southern coast, that doesn't often have the chance to make its way up towards London. If I can bring him some, he says that he'll tell me what he knows. And in between those two things, there's a lot to find, literally and metaphorically. Literally, you have a bat on the ship, and if you press this button, you can send the bat loose, and like a proverbial dove, it may or may not return to your ship with information of an island nearby. Sailing can be dangerous, and you burn through supplies at a rate that might surprise you, so stopping to pick up new goodies, sell off old ones, or just stopping to take in the sights can be a good idea. If you're able to drop anchor somewhere, you should really consider dropping anchor there. There's something to do or see basically everywhere you go, and because the world of the Undersea is fairly disconnected, people back home at London will pay top dollar for a write-up on the ports you land at. But metaphorically, one of the big things I found is that Sunless Sea made me laugh. Like, a lot. Which surprised me, because from the outside, I don't think Sunless Sea really sells itself as a funny game. What the game is, however, is absurd. And I don't mean to say that the game is bad, or poorly made, or that its premise is flawed. I think the game is great, and that the writers executed their vision with a great amount of skill. It's just the outcome of that execution is absurdity. And this game is absurd, right from its story's opening lines. The choices you make, the people you meet, the things you'll encounter, none of them make any logical sense. But because all of it is illogical, there's a sort of logic to it. Like if one clown showed up and started working in your office on the 18th floor, you and all of your coworkers might think, hey, that doesn't make sense. But if everyone working in the office on the 18th floor was a clown, then there's nothing illogical about that. Everyone's in on the joke, so there is no joke. Sunless Sea is kind of a game about being the only person in the office on the 18th floor who isn't a clown. The illogicality of this world is entirely grounded, and it's only us as the outside observer who doesn't get it. In reality, Sunless Sea is a game about a lot of things. My first playthrough, I was a disgraced priest trying to find something in this world. My bosun was a ferret that existed only in the duology of comatose or feral, and the well-being of the crew and myself often depended on how long we could maintain its comatose state. I did have the option of hiring someone else, but honestly, the pay that the ferret demanded was so much better than market standard that it was worth the hassle of losing a crewman to rabies every month or so. Also worth the hassle, at least for the moment, was my chief engineer, a woman who'd been stung by a parasitic wasp and had had both of her eyes replaced with 2 massive glowing eggs. The larvae that sit within her skull slowly grow and put more and more pressure on her brain each day. At least, I think that's what's happening. I can't imagine she was always so keen to express herself in wild riddles and erotic visions. Sometimes she's fun to listen to, but sometimes I really just need the engines to run. The only thing I really know about her for sure is her last desire. She's fully aware that when these eggs hatch that she will die, a thing that she has come to terms with, stating how familiar she feels with the larvae that wriggle within her eyes. But King Eater's castle, she says. I'd like to see King Eater's castle through these eyes before I go. In what's left of her mind, these things seem to even each other out. So I'll add it to the itinerary. Probably somewhere near the top. Once we pulled into port at the run-down dock of a long-since dilapidated private island. The lone manor that stood atop the island seemed abandoned, but we knocked anyways. Always best to be polite when on uncertain shores. A woman answered, dressed as a maid, who told us that yes, the sisters will have you in for lunch. Thank you for coming. The sisters, 3 of them, each asked for our crew's time. Not together, but separate. When we finally decided to dine with Cynthia, the oldest of the 3, we were suddenly whisked away to the shoreline, finding ourselves already engaged in lunch, eating something that we all chose to believe wasn't people. We were concerned about the meat. The game was concerned with making sure that we knew that bats were nesting in Cynthia's hair. That's why it's so messy. No other reason in particular. Do you want to take a plate with you for the road? And this is what I mean when I say that Sunless Sea makes me laugh, even if it's not sold as a comedy. One of the key selling points of any good joke is its unpredictability, the turn at the end, the outcome being entirely unexpected. The illogicality of them. So to me, it makes perfect sense that Sunless Sea is a very funny game. This game is absurd, and that's what makes it so fun. But Sunless Sea is not a funny game. It is, at its core, a game with strong horror elements, a deep fear of the unknown, and no guarantee that you'll survive your journey. In fact, it near assures the opposite. Once I stumbled into the far southern seas looking for a friendly port to maybe pick up that aforementioned coffee, only to instead find a flock of subterranean birds that were more than happy to swoop down to pick off my crew one by one. Fog banks rolled in without warning, and soon it was just me, the ferret, and all wasp eyes. But equally core to the game is that it seems to refuse to give in to that fear entirely. Once we pulled into port at an island called Visage, named for the massive stone face that sat at the center of the island. The people there didn't have food for us, which was a bummer because that's what we'd stopped there looking to buy, but they had masks. Everyone had a mask. And when we departed our ship to come ashore, we were all given masks by Moonmoth, the person tasked with guiding us. The purpose of these masks, they explained, were many-fold. They hid our own faces, as showing them would be a scandal, but in their culture these masks also inform the intentions of the wearer. Or at least, they're supposed to. "Trade masks with me," said Moonmoth, having pulled me away from the group and into a small closet. "I'll trade in your visitor mask and catch a departing ship out of here. I have to get my life back." Wearing the face of another, I allowed myself to experience Visage at the pace the island seemed to desire, and in doing so, I found the entire island to be unexpectedly cordial. Whilst the anonymity of the internet is capable of bringing out our worst, Visage seems to say that applying that same anonymity to personal interaction brings out our best. If we never know to whom we're speaking, perhaps it's best to just be polite. After all, things said aloud can have far greater consequences than things said over wires. Once I got carried away with the crowd, and we walked into the ear of the stone face at the heart of the island. And within the cavernous space of the empty head was perfect darkness. In that darkness, all of us, with no need for them, removed our masks. And in that darkness, all of us, completely anonymous, shared our secrets. In the game's own words, you needn't guard your face because no one can see you. You needn't scheme about how to use the information because you do not know whose secret this is. They're not the most dreadful of secrets, or the most evil things you know, but they're entrusted to you as confession, and because no one knows who's speaking, there's no judgment. Truthfully, I'd have stayed on Visage forever if I could have. But that's not how the game works. I sailed away from Visage with a deep longing. For a game that focuses on and pulls so much from deep horror, from the fear of the unknown, the fact that it was this island of anonymity that seemed to be the most unashamedly beautiful thing in the undersea was delightfully unexpected. Sunless Sea, to me, feels like a game that understands its genres and its theming and refuses to give any ground to the consequences of those concepts. It's a game with strong horror elements, but insists on undercutting those elements with either some quick lines, some bit of dry humor that at least for me always hit, or something unexpectedly beautiful. And this made me curious. And so because the goal of the video essayist is to dig deeper, I did that. And what I found was an even deeper appreciation for this game. You see, this game pulls a lot, like honestly most of its existence, from the Lovecraft genres. There is some classic deep-sea cosmic horror at work here, which means that to understand why the way this game uses its themes means so much to me, we need to talk about cosmic horror, the fear of the unknown, and the origin of the genre. Which means we need to talk about the man behind the ideas, whose fears are now inspiration, and whose ideals still live on in the works of the genre named for him. We need to talk about the inherent absurdity of the Lovecraft mythos. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August 20th, 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, and it basically went downhill from there. He was born to not quite incredible wealth, but enough wealth still for his family to have considerable comfort in the form of hired servants for their estate. That comfort didn't last long into Howard's life, however, as by the time he was 3, his father suffered a psychotic break and was committed to the Butler Hospital until his death just 5 years later. In between those events, Howard lived with his mother and some extended family, notably his maternal aunts and their parents. In 1896, his grandmother passed away, and while there's little to indicate Howard's relationship with her, this death was the catalyst for incredible darkness within the family. Howard himself would write that her passing cast a gloom upon the family from which they never recovered. Broken over the loss of their mother, his own mother and aunts began wearing black mourning dresses, garbs that terrified him. Perhaps not so incidentally, this was the same time period that young Howard, between the ages of 5 and 6, began suffering from night terrors, routinely haunted in his sleep by creatures he would later call night gaunts. These beings would eventually become reoccurring entities in his own writing, and their depiction is not unlike the drawings that other sufferers produce of what we today would refer to as a sleep paralysis demon. The year 1900 and the birth of a new century brought further weight upon the family, as Howard's grandfather, Whipple, began experiencing financial downturn on most of his business fronts, which eroded the family's wealth and ability to maintain any sort of their previously established lifestyle. Soon, the hired servants were gone, and the family was left alone to their estate. 4 years later, Whipple's single largest venture fell apart on him, and within months, he was dead from a stroke. There was no chance the remaining family could support the estate. Howard and his mother moved to a small duplex. He was 14 years old at the time, and in later letters, Howard would refer to this as among the darkest periods of his life, often considering the value of suicide, though stating that his interest in better understanding the world and its workings kept him from doing so. Later in the year of the move, he began high school, though his capabilities and such are perhaps a little inconclusive. Some sources say he excelled in chemistry and physics, other sources say he suffered greatly from arithmophobia, a fear of numbers, or maybe just a few specific numbers. Regardless, it was a diagnosis that could potentially make either of those subjects unmanageable. Furthermore, he had to be removed from his schooling multiple times for differing lengths due to nervous breakdowns that left him unable to perform his academic duties. In 1908, he was removed a final time. He never graduated, and while he maintained at times the idea of attending Brown University, he never continued his education. Records and accounts of his time at school paint him as someone who struggled greatly with a great number of things. Howard's life from 1908 to 1913 are largely a sort of dark age. He lived alone with his mother in continuing financial decline. His relationship with said mother is a thing of contention. Howard once said that he considered his mother a positive marvel of consideration. His mother once said that she considered Howard so hideous that he hid from everyone and did not like to walk upon the streets where people could gaze upon him. Oof. She bought him a chemistry set, though. He could barely use it despite his desires to do so because of his aforementioned distaste for numbers, something that as a dedicated writer I can be empathetic towards. In 1914 and onwards, he assumed from time to time various positions of employment related in some way or another to writing, but I think the point of greatest interest would begin in 1920, as this was when he began penning what would become known as the Cthulhu mythos. Interestingly, only a year later he penned The Outsider, regarded to by some analysts as his best work, and regarded to by himself as the work that closest meets the style of his personal idol, that being Edgar Allan Poe. This was, however, also the year that his mother died. She passed away in Butler Hospital, the same place as his father. While Lovecraft's initial reaction was grief, again putting him on the border of suicide, he eventually wrote that her passing came with an amount of relief. Given the odd nature of their relationship, sometimes removing uncertainty is best. Reportedly, his health began to improve around this time. In 1924, he married a woman named Sonia Green, though it didn't last forever. The why isn't relevant now, but we'll talk about it more later. During the time of their marriage, however, he did the bulk of his writing, a great deal of which he published, or attempted to publish, through a magazine called Weird Tales. This became complicated when Howard declined the position of editor with the company, stating a distaste for the idea of moving to Chicago due to aesthetic reasons. The position then went to a Farnsworth Wright, an author who Howard had previously heavily criticized. He didn't get published much after. In fact, he didn't get published much at all. The first edition of his first book, the 1936 edition of The Shadow over Innsmouth, only saw 400 copies printed, with only 200 of them even being bound. The unlucky other half were destroyed. The printed copies didn't even come with a dust cover. And on March 15th of 1937, not even a year after his first book was published, Howard passed away from intestinal cancer. Due to a fear of doctors, he didn't pursue any insight into his rapidly failing health until a month before he died. I've read that it was a brutal passing, and that he did his best to journal his experience approaching the grave, which he did dutifully until he was unable to hold a pen any longer. A few days later, he died and was buried at Swan Point Cemetery at his hometown of Providence, barely 10 minutes from the house he'd lived in. He'd probably have liked that, being so close. He never really was one for the outside world, or the world outside Providence. And for a while, that's where it ended. A man of no particular renown in his time left to an unpleasant end in a place that he knew. The end. Or at least I wish it was. I would like to be able to tell you that Howard was just the things I just told you. I would like to be able to tell you that he was just an author who achieved cult classic status, whose work simply went unappreciated during his time, only to later be cherished too late to be impactful. But that would be omitting a great deal of things. And when those things are fundamental to who Howard really was and exist as core elements in his work, I can't omit them. Primarily, Howard was a man who was afraid, and this near-universal fear deeply and greatly informed his writing and his life. When he declined the editorial position with Weird Tales, stating that he didn't want to move to Chicago, it's important to note that at that time he was living in New York, a place that he undeniably hated. In 1925, Howard wrote He, a story in which the narrator describes a sense of horror and oppression living in New York, a sense that threatens to annihilate the narrator. Of course, the narrator is just Howard, expressing himself through his art. But he still wouldn't move to Chicago, because Chicago was the unknown, and isn't it always better to just be tormented by the things we know? Of course, this made any advancing technology in the world around him harder and harder to cope with. In his 1928 story Cool Air, Howard essentially assigns the role of primary antagonist to the relatively newfangled air conditioner, something that Howard ascribed the powers to preserve a life beyond death to, not perfectly, but in a way that slows the inevitable slime that we must all be reduced to via the constant application of ammonia. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was a man who was deeply afraid of the unknown, of the things he didn't understand, which were many, and to repeat myself, I wish that was it. But it isn't. Because Howard Phillips Lovecraft was also a white supremacist. That's why he hated New York. There were too many others, with all of their little unknowns. And he was the really hardcore kind, where even if you were white, you might not have been the right kind of white. Sorry, all of Ireland. But more than that, he was also a race purist, with the belief that the point of the French should be to make more French, the point of the German to make more German, and so on. Ergo, interbreeding was, we'll call it undesirable. And whether or not you already knew this might depend on how closely you follow his own works as opposed to works that follow his themes and genres. For example, the idea of Cthulhu and the city of R'lyeh aren't inherently racist. The notion that space is a scary thing or that the deep sea is dangerous aren't bigotry. But his own words are. Buck Robinson, the Harlem Smoke, was a loathsome gorilla-like thing with abnormally long arms, which I couldn't help calling forelegs, and a face that conjured up thoughts of unspeakable Congo secrets and hum-tom pounding under an eerie moon. The body must have looked even worse in life, but the world holds many ugly things. If you couldn't tell, the narrator of this story is describing the corpse of a black man, a boxer who died in the ring. This is an excerpt from Herbert West Reanimator, and this is far from his only piece of writing that I genuinely don't feel comfortable reading, especially on this platform, which is shown to be more than a little trigger-happy with the concept of demonetization. Hopefully you can get the idea from the notion that, to Lovecraft, a way for a black man to be less monstrous is to die, more specifically, to be killed. But it wasn't just his storytelling. In 1913, he wrote a letter critical of Fred Jackson, a fellow writer published in the same magazine as him called Argosy. He wrote that Jackson's stories were effeminate, with the characters showcasing passions and emotions proper to Negroes and anthropoid apes. As part of his work in 1914 as the chairman of public criticism of the United Amateur Press Association, he wrote about his distaste for immigrants and the damage they supposedly did to the English language. I'm not going to read any more of his writing aloud, nor will I tell you the titles of some of his unpublished poems, mostly because I don't think I'd be allowed to on this platform. If you want further evidence of his beliefs in racial superiority or separation, it's not that hard to find. Google his cat. I will tell you, however, that he did marry a Jewish woman, that aforementioned Sonia Green, for a portion of his life, but did so under the personal idea that she was, and I quote, well assimilated, aka one of the good ones, though he still treated her about as well as you'd expect for someone who held that kind of opinion about their partner. Late into their failing marriage, because of Howard's failure to find a reliable job, Green was forced to move out of state for work, and despite suffering poor health, had to travel often for her job. It's said that she only stayed at Howard's small apartment in New York that she paid for once or twice per month. When they eventually decided to divorce, Green moved to California to start anew. Howard moved back to Providence, Rhode Island, and he never bothered to sign the paperwork finalizing the divorce, despite telling her that he had. As we begin to understand the depths of Lovecraft's personal prejudices, we're forced to make the uncomfortable recognition that when Lovecraft writes in The Shadow over Innsmouth about the horrors of humans interbreeding with monstrous races that defy comprehension, what he's really writing about is people who are white having sex with people who don't happen to be white, or don't happen to be the right kind of white, or might not even happen to be the same kind of white as each other. Let's just establish what I really want to say here. Racism is absurd. It's fucking stupid, and out of all of the ideologies that required Howard to fundamentally misunderstand the world around him, it's almost definitely the one that speaks poorest about the content of his character. And politely, I won't let this be a thing where I sideline the wretchedness of Lovecraft's racial ideologies under the guise of him simply being a man of his times. The biography written about him by S.T. Joshi, a man considered to be a leading authority on Lovecraft and his work, plainly states that even by the 1930s, any scientific justification for racism had been demolished. Lovecraft was wrong, and that's just the truth. Editing Thane here, for a second. This quote from Joshi was a small fractal intended to express that even people who are well-versed in Lovecraft understand that he was a fool. In the words of C.G.P. Gray, however, every fractal is its own world, and this quote and this man are no exception. If you want a full breakdown on this strange man and his strange thoughts on an even stranger man, consider coming to my Patreon page, where I essentially have a mini essay on S.T. Joshi in the director's commentary for this essay. Anyways, as I was saying, but it would also feel incorrect to not directly acknowledge a second truth. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was a broken person. On a fundamental level, core attributes of his being were just shattered. Basically, from the first moment his brain was old enough to start being aware of the world around him, it must have seemed as though that world around him was intent on bringing him low, as though some terrible power far outside control or comprehension had chosen him specifically to bear witness to things humans were never meant to experience. Maybe that's where the rest of him really came from. Because Howard Phillips Lovecraft believed, at his core, things that are fundamentally wrong, observably incorrect, and he used those beliefs as ground-level ideology, be they racial or technological, that the mass of his literary work is built off of. A fear of the unknown, regardless of what that unknown is. And while I can be sympathetic to the things outside his control that clearly damaged the young boy he once was, I can't be sympathetic to what became of him, to the person that he grew into. Cancer cells don't mean to become cancer. Nonetheless, we remove them. All of this, though, leads us to two questions, the first of which being the inevitable for this particular style of video, that being, can you separate art from its artist? I won't beat around the bush, I'll tell you the answer is no. Anyone who makes art of any kind will tell you the emotional expression inherent to any given project. Art doesn't exist on accident, and it's fundamentally fueled by its creator. The art only exists because of the artist. Saying that an art piece can be removed from the person who created it is an inherent fallacy. These videos I make are extensions and expressions of my thoughts, beliefs, and the way I see the world that surrounds me, and to say any different would just be wrong. Categorically untrue to the fullest extent of the concept. But there's a second, more difficult question to this. In my research, I've come to suspect that most people who know of the Lovecraft mythos and cosmic horror genre just don't know that much about Howard Phillips Lovecraft as a person. He died almost a century ago, he didn't sell particularly well while he was alive, and it's only through countless additions to his mythos and overall genre via the miracle of the public domain that his name has any recognition today. So if we simply never knew that Lovecraft's genres were so inherently linked to prejudice and ignorance and hate, does it still matter? Because when Miyazaki was acting as a lead on Bloodborne, I somehow doubt he decided to pursue cosmic horror as a frontline design choice because he needed a way to outlet his distaste for the Celts. It was probably just a vibe that he'd seen in other works and knew he could use well to match the previous vibes of Demon and Dark Souls while also mixing in new horror elements. And when Nicolas Cage decided that he'd play one of the lead roles in the 2019 film adaptation of A Color Out of Space, I doubt that he did so because he felt it helped bolster ideas of racial purity that he holds value in. He's just an actor, and a particularly quirky one at that. At least, as far as I know. He's never told me otherwise. If I sort by the Lovecraftian tag on Steam, how many hundreds of games pop up? How many of them have I already added to my wishlist over time? How many of them have I already played? And how many of these games even considered Lovecraft's original ideas as opposed to just using themes classed under Lovecraftian genres? An idea is only as true as our understanding of it, and if we don't understand work made in Lovecraft's name to be racist, if we don't know the truth behind the genre named for him, if we can look at a medium and fail to know or remember the ideology behind the game, behind the book, behind the book, behind the book, behind the man, if we don't know that a thing like this was made from hate, that the core of this genre is hate, is there still hate there? I don't know the answer. I don't think there is an answer, at least not a clean one, because the bounds of morality are about as undefinable as the horrors from Lovecraft's work, and I hate that answer because it feels like a cop-out, it feels like a cheat, like I've brought you all this way only to tell you that there wasn't a point. It feels like when I was a college student and we would write papers that discussed the most shallow take just to get something done quickly the night before it was due, only to briefly introduce a deeper concept, to tease the existence of something actually exciting, only to say that further exploration of that particular note was beyond the scope and scale of this essay because we wanted to sound smarter or make whatever boring topic we were writing on seem more interesting by latching on the idea of something actually worth discussing. But it's true. If you follow any content about D&D on YouTube, you might be familiar with the name Z Bashu. He makes these really great animated shorts to talk about individual spells or concepts within the game, but he makes it really clear that his actual authority within the space is, well, non-existent. He's described himself at times, in fact his whole modern image exists, as the guy who works the counter at the game shop. The platform might seem like authority, but he didn't make the game. He didn't write the rules. And that's me. I never studied race science, or did any particularly educated or guided looks at the impact to people or culture that something like Lovecraft's work can carry. Throughout all of my time at college, I took a single human anthropology class that I nearly failed because I just didn't give a shit about the course load, and I paid for it. Almost $1,000 if you spread it all out just for that one class. Imagine spending a whole ass grand and not giving a shit about the thing you bought. The point being, I don't have any authority here. I'm not educated in any particular way about this topic. Fuck, most of what I learned about Lovecraft in this essay you could find yourself on the first page of Google's results if you just search Lovecraft's full name. I'm just a guy that thinks racism is absurd. But if you've made it this far in the video, maybe you'd be interested in hearing what I think anyways. I think it's important to make choices with as much knowledge as possible. Ironically, Lovecraft reportedly was very open to the idea of people using his concepts or referencing his creations in their own, and maybe that's part of why his ideas, carrying elements of his ideology, are so common. But I don't know if I'll be able to see any more of those elements in any form without thinking about Buck Robinson. But I don't think playing Bloodborne means you're racist. And I don't think that enjoying a Nicolas Cage rendition of A Color Out of Space indicates anything about the content of your character. But as I did research for this video, it was a very rare thing for any source to talk about the content of Howard's character. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they chose to ignore. Maybe they didn't care. But I care. I care a lot. It can be said that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, something that I don't quite agree with, but I'll capitulate that it's really fucking hard. And sometimes we don't want to have to watch a 30-minute essay on the thoughts and beliefs of a person who died 86 years ago and is only well known because of people taking his own works and making new things just to see if it's okay to enjoy those new things. But I also think we need to know. We need to be educated in the things we consume. We need to understand the depths and concepts behind the things we enjoy or use as inspiration in our own works. We need to understand that when something directly inspires us, it means that our words aren't exclusively ours anymore. Using someone else's ideas unavoidably carries those ideas forward with us. And when we carry other people's ideas, I think we also need to respond to them in kind, respond to them appropriately. Not to answer hate with hate, but to understand that Lovecraft's style of hate was fucking stupid, utterly absurd at its very core, and to represent the man behind the mythos, his direct ideas and personal beliefs with the same attitude. So when I play Sunless Sea, I just really appreciate what the devs did with this game, because I feel like they used a really solid grasp of the themes present in Lovecraft-influenced genres, but that they answered those themes in kind. Because I don't think about Buck Robinson when I sail the Undersea. I think about how I'm going to feed my crew and where the guy who got carried off by bats went. I think about if those bats that carried him off are the same ones that nest in Cynthia's hair. Maybe that's where the meat came from. I think about how great it is that the god Salt took us to King Eater's castle when we prayed to be delivered to a port, which is great for my first mate, but leaves the rest of us super distant from our original goal. I think about Visage and a small, tight corridor and a huge open space. I think about trust and the comfort that I won't be judged for the things I regret, and that I can celebrate the wonders of others, whoever they might be. I think the devs did a really good job here, because I feel like they answered absurdity with absurdity. And I think that's the best you can do.
With the completion of another video, it's important to me that I get the opportunity to step outside. I live in and around some really beautiful places, but when I get deep into the video making process, I have the tendency to obsess a little bit, which is not always healthy, but it's what I do. So for me, getting the opportunity to come out and enjoy the beautiful places I live around is a really big step in recognizing that another project is completed. Pretty much the only thing that comes after this is the uploading and the deletion of the working files until only the final project remains. And I'm sure to some people, the idea of deleting all of those working files is likewise an unhealthy trait, but I've been accused of having a bit of a perfectionist personality when it comes to my creative works. So things like this are important to signal to myself that it's time to move on to the next thing. This has been my longest project to date, and if I were being totally honest, I'm not really sold on it, but I think that's part of the perfectionist thing that I've been told I deal with. It was a lot of fun though. It did take me back to when I was in college in more ways than one. Mostly getting the opportunity to just do a bunch of research on a topic and learn what I think about it. It was my first project that actually required that research, and it wasn't just me talking about my emotional reactions or the way I feel about stuff. It's a video that somehow feels both way too long and way too short. There are so many things that I wish I had said or had more time to say. But the truth is, I am still a little bit too small of a channel, too dependent on the whims of an algorithm that may or may not remember me by the time this video goes up, to spend as much time as I would like on the content that I make. But I don't ever want to become a channel that is too dependent on any singular entity or media to make content about. Which means I do eventually have to drop what I'm working on and move to something new. And these hikes helps me get my brain into a relaxed state to start a new project with. All of that said, if you're still watching to this part in the video, you've either fallen asleep or you probably have some inkling of what's coming next. I've hinted to it twice throughout the video. I've only been uploading for barely 3 months now, but the support that I'm seeing with those 4, now 5, I think, videos from those people on Patreon is really helping shape what the future of this channel looks like. Channels like this one are slow to grow, but having that constant support from my patrons helps make the future of this channel a potential and a reality. So, with that thought in mind, I'm prepared to offer you a trade. You give me your support on Patreon, and I will give you ad-free versions of all of my work, including both the essays and the director commentaries, as well as any companion videos that get made about the projects I'm working on. Additionally, you get access to the Patreon-only Discord, where you can chat with me both in general and as I work on more projects. And your presence there can help fuel the future of this channel in more than just your monetary support. I didn't even know what the Sunless Games or Fallen London was until one of my patrons suggested I play it after I did my Hades video. And as you might have guessed from me making a 32-minute video about it, I was kind of a fan. So, if any of that sounds interesting to you, or you just want to help make sure that I get to make this content for as long as I possibly can, then your support on Patreon and your presence in that community means everything to me. I'm really excited about the future of this channel, and I hope you are too. I think there's cool things on the horizon. Okay, anyways, it's like definitely about to rain pretty hard. I gotta get the fuck out of here.